Welcome to the Sellosophy podcast. And why do we call it Sellosophy? It's because it's the combination of the words sales and philosophy. Today, I have a very awesome guest that is joining me today. Her name is Katey Maddux, and this guest has such an inspiring journey. And today's theme is talking about how do you turn pain into purpose. And Katey is the founder of Millennial Accounting, a trailblazer in the world of entrepreneurship and accounting. Growing up surrounded by accountants and entrepreneurs, I never saw herself going down that path, but life had different plans for her, and so she embraced challenges and also has a very unique and purposeful story to tell. So Katey's very multifaceted, kind of like me. I'm like a musician, and I love comedy, but I also love finance, and so she's also involved in so many incredible activities and purposes. So Katey, welcome. Anything else that you'd like to share with the audience about you that would be important before we get started?
I don't think so. I feel like it'll just kind of come out while we're talking.
Yeah, that's
Important
awesome.
stuff.
So we've chatted a little bit. We talked in a few conferences online. We've built a friendship. I know that you know my brother Hector in the world of accounting, which is also how I kind of got into it. And I've really loved following you through the socials and sort of the message that you have and how inspirational, and you're such a vocal leader. You also just show so much courage about just kind of being your authentic self. And I think that's what's drawn, me to reach out to you and invite you and learn more about your story. And so when we, in our small conversations, we talked about how do you turn adversity or pain into purpose.
Yeah.
And I kind of just want to see if you can give us a little bit of an insight to your path, your journey, and how that has impacted you and how you turn that into your purpose.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. I'm super excited to have the opportunity to share, my story and connect with people. I think it's so cliche almost to be like, yeah, I use my adversity as my fire, but honestly, I think it gives you a reason to heal. And when you can use your pain and make it a roadmap for others, it gives it purpose because otherwise it's just really painful. And healing is painful, and doing the therapy is painful, and sometimes reliving those experiences because that sometimes is required to process them, right? You can't process it when it's all in your head. You have to talk through it or write through it or, do some sort of processing for your brain to make sense of it so you can heal from it. And in my case, I'm a rape survivor, and that's really where it kind of spawned from. Was I was in Peru actually doing some mission work, and I had never told people about my rape. Like my family didn't know, my friends didn't know. I very much kept it a secret for years. And I felt like on that trip that God told me, I want you to get on stage. I mean, there were other events, that kind of led up to this, but this was like the big shocking moment was I felt like God said, I want you to get up on stage at the next school you go to and tell them your story. And we got to that school and it was 1,000 kids. And I'm like, you want me to talk about something that's completely private to me in front of 1,000 teenagers? Are you crazy? You know what I mean? And that for me was so scary. And I was sobbing through the whole thing. I had a translator and I'm like crying, and then I'd have to stop so she could translate. It was a really intense, one of the most intense moments of my life. But I remember afterward, um, somebody brought this young girl over to me. She couldn't have been more than like 12. And they said, Katey, she wants to tell you something. And through her translator, she basically told me, she said, I live in a home for sexually abused girls who've been taken out of their homes. She goes, and I'm going to go home and tell all the girls your story because I think it's going to give them hope. Like, just all the tears. And I came home from that trip being like, wow, this story can actually help somebody else. And that's when it became something of, okay, it's not just my problem, it's not just my adversity. I have to heal from this. I have to be able to give this away as a roadmap to somebody else. Like what happened to you doesn't have to define you. You get to use it to encourage other people that there is hope and there is healing. So while at that time it was still a really painful thing, now when I talk about it, people are like, why are you talking about the fact that you were raped with a smile on your face? And I say, because it's not painful anymore. And because I know that by using that story, I get to help encourage other people and bring hope to other women.
Wow. Wow. It, I'm speechless, but also so moved by that story. And you transported me to that moment, when you have to open up, be vulnerable, uh, publicly share something so private and so intimate. And it just takes so much courage. And so I admire you for that so much. And in and I'm sure that, as you mentioned, I think talking about it, accepting it, and much like, of course, there's no comparison to your unique experience, but there are some transferable lessons that one can take away from when you go through such a traumatic, painful, and adversity. What are some How can you respond to it? And as I think about the hero's journey, or sort of the when someone has to make a decision because of pain, typically there are four characters in a hero story, right? You have the hero, the victim, the villain, and the guide. And so you have made a decision because of your pain, and typically the hero or the villain is born both out of the same thing, pain,
Right.
right? And the hero chooses to do something good with it. The villain chooses to do something bad with it, right? The villain
Hmm.
kind of wants to get back at the world because of, that they initially, before becoming a villain, become the victim.
Yeah.
And then you have chosen the path of not only being the hero of your own story, but also the guide to many others.
Hmm.
And so, as we transition sort of into that concept of how you guide others, um, in the world of entrepreneurship, how do you leverage these lessons that you've learned, and sort of what tips do you give to entrepreneurs who are faced with daily challenges, or maybe they think of something and because of something in their past, they are defined by it. So what are some maybe steps you can recommend them for them to overcome these challenges?
Yeah, I think when it comes to entrepreneurship, like your business is only as healthy as you are. And so, as long as you have trauma, limiting beliefs, lies that you're believing about yourself, right? Your business has a glass ceiling on it. Like you can want to go further, but you're stuck unknowingly, right? And one of the things when I was first getting into speaking at conferences and kind of sharing my story, I felt like I got home from that trip and God was like, this is your platform and I want you to use it for good, you know? And so I went home, I isolated myself for 30 days, and I wrote a keynote. And the keynote was called Purpose in Pain. And how do you really use your pain to not only propel yourself, but really to be that guide for other people? And in doing so, I got this idea of something called the ACT method, which is acknowledge your pain, commit to healing, and tell your story. And so many times, I feel like people aren't able to heal from the things that they have gone through because they're not willing to acknowledge how traumatic it was. And I think so many times, even for me, at first I was like, I don't have any trauma. I had a pretty decent childhood. When I actually started doing the therapy and the healing, there was a lot of pain in my childhood that I never labeled as traumatic because we like to put our pain on a scale and be like, well, this person lost their parents and their life was so much harder. I don't get to label my own pain as something traumatic. But as long as you're not willing to give language to it, you can't acknowledge it. And if you can't acknowledge it, you can't heal from it, right? It's the same concept as like an AA, right? You have to acknowledge I'm an alcoholic in order to heal from alcoholism. Right? You know what I mean? Like it's not a new concept. Um, and so I think that can even apply to business, right? Like if you're struggling with sales, if you're struggling with, you have to acknowledge sales is a skill. I grew up with parents who had a poverty mindset, or
Mm,
they were afraid of money, or money was the devil, or whatever that thing was that trained your way of thinking. You have to acknowledge, okay, in order for me to get to where I am, from where I am to where I want to be, I need to acknowledge that there's a block, right?
yeah.
And so I think that ACT method can be applied to healing a personal trauma or healing something that's going to help you in business. And that's really why I even created my podcast, is because I'm like, I've learned lessons and I know so many of the people in my circle have learned lessons that maybe just by speaking about them will encourage somebody else to be like, oh, that was a block they had. They didn't even know it was a block until you heard somebody else say it's a block, you know? And I can heal from it too. I can overcome
Sure.
this too.
Yeah. I mean, so much to unpack. I love the acronym ACT. So it was acknowledge. What was the next one?
Yeah, acknowledge your pain, commit to healing, and tell your story.
Yeah. And that's exactly what you're doing here as well, right? And I think it sounds like I feel as well that going out there and helping others is sort of a healing part of the healing process too,
It is.
right? Because, part of helping yourself is by being able to share your lessons, share your journey, share the obstacles, and also prove to others that there is a better path to navigating, challenges and adversity. And in the world of accounting, I have had the privilege to help and coach entrepreneurs, firm owners, and there are sort of these interesting patterns or themes, and it all starts with mindset. And then, the mindset is usually shaped by certain belief systems, and the
Right.
belief systems are typically shaped by their childhood, right? Like kind of the
Hmm.
inner child. Sometimes society sort of shapes us to think a certain way or make things somewhat binary. And a lot of it, we might learn it from our parents or
Yep.
those who are parental figures. And it's when we break away from that and not feel any guilt towards disagreeing maybe with the way our parents raised us or disagreeing with because their environment were totally different, right? They
Right.
technology was different, political environment, the way the world is viewed from social. I mean, if we even go into race, religion, I mean, so many other
Yeah.
factors. And today, there's so many things that are more tolerable, acceptable. We have just a higher level of consciousness, and we have to break away from those limited beliefs. To your point, so I guess my question to you in the accounting space, in your experience, when you're coaching folks, what are some typical blocks that they run into, and how have you helped them overcome that? If you were to share some
I
tips
think,
there.
yeah, I think like when I'm speaking at conferences, um, the last two kind of topics that I was really hitting on, one was on the differences between generations and how that applies to marketing your business and bringing on clients. And then the one before that was on onboarding. And I think there's a through line to both of those, which is people need to understand, see, and have kind of an inner, like there needs to be a window into your authentic self. And the level of authenticity that you bring to your platform will will not only bring the right people, but people will trust you. And in business, especially in accounting, right, where they're giving us their social security numbers, their banking, like talk literal trust, but also accountants are like therapists. We're like finance therapists, right?
Sure.
Like people's books, those are very sacred things to them. When somebody opens you up to the way they spend their money, they don't need to tell you their habits, right? As accountants, we know all of our clients' habits and we probably know them better than they do because we have an awareness, a higher level of awareness of finances. And so when someone shows me how they spend their money, it is a very vulnerable thing. And so
Yeah.
as accountants, we become these therapists and we have this really vulnerable relationship with them. And if we're not careful, it can be a lot of pointing fingers, but when we show up first as the vulnerable one, like on my social media, I try to be very vulnerable. When I'm speaking on conferences, I try to be very vulnerable so that they're getting an authentic me and it breaks down that wall, that barrier, so that when they show up, they feel comfortable being authentic with me and being like, hey, here's the real story of my finances. Because it
Hmm.
is a very personal thing.
It is. Definitely. And, when you said, they're financial therapists, I wrote this word down. I had learned this when COVID hit and I was in the bank. I had a really great leader tell us as a team, and it was really inspiring. You remember the PPP program, right?
Absolutely.
And what a major role accountants had to play during that time, but not only accountants, but also bankers, because
Hmm.
bankers were the ones who needed to give access to the money to
Hmm.
the actual
The
business
gatekeepers.
owners. and I was part of a huge project where we were building the airplane while I was in the air kind of
Right.
thing. We,
Yeah.
we had to build a lending platform to be
Yeah.
able to funnel all of this
Totally.
government money into our customers so that they can get access to PPP funds, so that they can stay in business, so that they survive, so that we save basically the world
Right.
in essence. And he said these terms because if you remember the when the lockdown happened, there was a lot of emphasis and of course a lot of appreciation for first responders.
Hmm.
And so he framed it in a way where I was just like, wow. And he said, "We are financial first responders."
Wow.
And that to me was like, wow. And that just put me on a level of responsibility,
Hmm.
and it just gave me a different sense of purpose. And I think that accountants also played that role
Hmm.
during the PPP. And so one thing that I think is noble about the accounting industry, but also could be a risk of it being sort of self-damaging, is that accountants tend to sort of, from a mindset standpoint, or from how maybe through the pain they're unable to push past the being overworked, how to handle awkward conversations, is because they aim to please, right? They're noble, they protect the client's information. You never really hear of accountants doing a lot of, I mean, there are a few, but very, very little, do a lot of ill-intended things. Like, it's not a profession where like customers don't trust accountants.
Right.
I mean, there's obviously a level of trust in the community, in the space, but there are a lot of challenges for accountants themselves to like self overcome these things of like not overly pleasing clients or avoiding difficult conversations. And I'm
Ah,
looking at my
totally get it.
notes, and it takes courage, right? It takes courage to do that. I would even venture to say accountants don't like being in front of a camera. And so I admire that, you being in the profession are sort of like a face or a representation of what it is to be courageous and authentic, and knowing that nothing bad's going to happen. If anything, you're doing some positive, you bring a positive light to the world, and helping accountants know that they can be their authentic selves, and it's going to, if anything, help drive their purpose forward. So, I guess, again, going back to what has been your experience with what I just shared around pleasers and avoiders, and and like, how do we help, this profession navigate towards recognizing their self, that value, so that they can command a higher price, and be able to provide the advice that they do, and not be overwhelmed, overworked, and feel like everything has to be an awkward conversation. That's a loaded question, so take your time.
It's so funny because I'm even walking through this myself right now. There's clients that like I've been working with them for years. I know I'm undercharging them, but I don't want to have the conversation because I know that the client's not going to like the conversation. You know what I mean? So even I, I felt so seen when you're talking about this. I'm like, oh, even I struggle with this. I don't think it
We all
even
do.
matters like how successful you are. There's always going to be things that are uncomfortable. And as soon as you get comfortable at one level, if you want to go to the next level, there's going to be another level of discomfort, you know? So I don't think that there's ever an end to being, oh, now I've got it all figured out. You know what I mean? Like, okay, I passed last year's barrier, but now there's this year's barrier, right?
Yeah.
And I think that being able to recognize that there's a block or there's that it's hard and bringing in someone who can encourage you and help you. One of my best friends is a sales coach. I know you do sales coaching too. And just being able to bring in someone like yourself and have that meeting because we so undervalue ourselves as
Yeah.
accountants. Like, even me, I'm like, I know I'm doing it. I don't know why I'm doing it, but I know that I'm doing it, you know?
Sure.
And just, you need that outside voice
Yeah.
to show you how valuable you are sometimes. And so just like investing in the coaching, investing in the mentorship, spend the money because what it will do for your brain is way more valuable than what it's going to do for your pocketbook.
Right on. And I'll tell you a quick little story. When I first broke away from the bank and I decided to go on my own, talking about recognizing your worth and
Mhm.
just me not even knowing about the value pricing concept. I told this is I'm gonna try to make this as short as possible. I told Hector, I'm done with working at the bank. I want to go on my own. He's like, what do you want to do? And it was funny. He was my guide at that time. I was the hero on this old world trying to go into the new world. New world is entrepreneurship. Old world is corporate life.
Right.
And I needed to go on a journey. And I said, I don't know what, but it's not banking. Like he's like, all right, go figure out what it is you love and what you're good at. And so I was in my couch one day and I just opened up Apple Notes and said, what am I good at? Like, what are my skills? So I was like, I love training. I don't mind doing public speaking. I love sales. I love sales coaching. So like everything kind of all led to this where I am today. I go back to Hector. I go, I got it. Sales coaching. I even got a name for the business. Exceed sales. And he's like, okay, what do you sell? I go, sales training. He goes, do you have a training? I'll get back to you. So so I go to the coffee shop. I know where here in Brickell,
Uh-huh.
Capital One, whatever, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I start on my little Google Slides and I start taking sales courses. I start building my own and I'm like, I can do this. I can, right? Imposter syndrome, fighting the confident,
So
I can
real.
do this thing, right? Finally, I got the presentation together. I go back and I'm like, I got it. Here's a presentation. And he's like looking at it and he's like, why do you want to talk about that? What do you want to talk about this? At the end, he's like, you could sell this. This is a product, you could sell it. I was like, my confidence is going up, right? And so now then he's like, all right, how much are go find, do you have a client? And I'm like, let me get back to you. Right. So every time it was like journey going on an obstacle,
Yeah.
overcome the obstacle. And it was just so nice to have a guide, to your point, of having someone guide you along the way.
Hmm.
So I go that weekend to my parents' house and I show it to my dad. My dad's insurance sales, and
Hmm.
he's part of like an insurance group.
Hmm.
He's like sitting down watching it, and he's like, "Oh, blah 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 blah," and he's just like self-assessing, just speaking out loud, being very vulnerable. He's like, "Yeah, I talk too much during sales conversations," and my mom's like shouting across in the kitchen, "Yeah, you talk too much. You're all the time. You're overly talking. You gotta let people know." And I'm just like, "Mom, Dad, focus, presentation, whatever, right?" so, so like all of this is happening. And he's like, this is very good. Let me talk to this lady who leads our insurance group to see if she would want this. This
Hmm.
is all during COVID.
Hmm.
So he calls her, he like texts me, he's like, she's interested, call her. I'm like, good, I got a lead.
Yeah.
So I got the lead, I talked to her, I pitched the thing. She's like, let's do it. I go, Hector, I got a client now. He's like, all right, what are you thinking about charging? And I was just like, in my head, I was like, $500. But then, because the way he asked it, I was like, $800. And he goes, charge 2,500. And like my heart kind of starts beating and my jaw drops a little bit. I'm just like, okay, right? Like I'm trusting someone that knows, but in my head, I didn't value myself enough.
Hmm.
So I did it. I presented it for 20, whatever the amount, waited a week. It was like silence. I'm like, oh crap, it was too much, whatever. She ended up accepting the deal. We closed
Wow.
it. But I share that journey and also when I talk to people, when I'm coaching them as well, to say, we you have to understand that the outcome, all right, the result that they're going to get, whatever you charge them will always be a fraction of it. And as long as you can trust that, right? Like the price that we charge is a fraction of the value they get. It's actually one of like the manifesto things that Hector has for his alt accountant community that we're part of for accounting.
Right.
And but anyways, it just kind of reminded me of that story. Let me just pause because I know that was a lot, but I want to ask you, do you remember your moment when you needed to change that too about yourself, the way you value yourself? Like not quite as maybe illustrative as I did,
Yesterday.
but did have you ever had one of those moments where you thought you were, maybe I'll charge this, and then like you had some maybe outside help, or you intervened with yourself and said, you know what, I am going to charge what I'm worth, and then you had the courage to do it, and the world didn't fall apart.
Yeah. I so many times. I think when I first started going to accounting conferences was in 2018, and I took a class by Deb Klissinger, who's now one of my good friends. But I remember her telling me that she was charging people. She didn't take clients. I might be butchering the number, but it was something like less than 3,000, I won't even take them on. And I was still charging hourly at like obscenely low prices. And I was like, what? Who would possibly pay that? You know what I mean? It was so mind blowing to me. But it's been a journey of raising my prices and adjusting for value, right? You can't just raise your prices and not add value. So adjusting how am I adding value? But I think it goes back to like what I was saying earlier of like the journey's never over. I
Mm-hmm.
literally am going through this right now with an older client who, a lot of times in sales world, they're just like, okay, drop the low-hanging fruit, start with new clients, right? And because you're not, it's really hard to change the mindset of a client who's used to paying hourly to changing them to value billing. Like it's a really hard shift, right? It's way easier just to take on new people at a new rate, right? Um, and so I think it's some of both. You don't just want to like drop all your old clients, drop all your steady, like some of these clients I've had for like 6, 7 years, like I don't want to drop my bread and butter, the people I have a relationship with who stuck through all the stuff that I've gone through when my business was not as stable, when it was more stable. You don't just want to like peace out, Um, but I do think it's a constant struggle of I also had a new consultation yesterday and I'm like, okay, my profitability has gone down because my costs have gone up and I haven't raised my prices. And so
Exactly.
in that first one, she said no. And I was like, man, am I doing the right thing? Maybe I'm charging too much, And my friend's like, Katey, you're still undercharging yourself. That just
Yeah.
wasn't good for her. And I think that's the barrier too, is like you can't just try it once and think that it's unsuccessful because it didn't work for that one person you tried it on. Try it 100 times. And if that doesn't work, okay, maybe change your strategy or even 50 times. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? But just because it's not right for someone doesn't mean that you're overcharging. It means it didn't work for them. And that's something I think it's really hard to remember because we
Sure.
we get discouraged and we're like, okay, let me just drop them back down because that was easier.
And there are so many elements to everything you're saying. I mean, that's why positioning is so important. Having a message that targets your niche, right? That resonates with them, that they know they're going to pay you to solve a problem because you're going to solve it much faster, right? Or they've tried 3 or 4 different ways of solving on their own. It's pain. Their level of pain is really high. So sometimes, niching down helps you also target the client that sees the value of paying you what you're charging. But one thing that you mentioned too about mindset shift is that I think for the accounting professor or any expert, that is offering their services, especially when it's knowledge or expertise
Mhm.
or advisory services, it's like, how much money do we spend? I know I spend a lot, and I know you do too, right? Like how many accountants go to conferences every year and they get CPE credits, and how much money they spend on their
Yeah.
own development, staying on top of, IRS regulations, changes to the industry, technology, like always looking to level up.
Right.
They're spending all this money and then the rates are staying the same. It just doesn't make sense. So we also have to mindset shift to say, as our knowledge and our experience grows, so do our prices,
Hmm.
because we're also shortening the gap of how fast we can solve the problem and the impact that it has. So, but because we have been so conditioned, at least the accounting profession, there's a few others like lawyers that go into this time inputs outputs. It's that switch is hard to kind of happen. So
Unlearn.
the path I unlearned the path to value pricing. It's about just sort of turning off this inputs outputs and focus on the customer, the
Mhm.
result that they want. And just so as long as what you charge will always be a fraction of the value they get, then you're on the right path, right?
Mhm.
There's a win-win, or as Ron Baker likes to say it, a double thank you moment. I don't know if you've heard about that
I
before.
love Ron Baker.
Yeah, he's the man. Yeah, so double thank you is like when you say thank you so much for your business, and the client says back to you, no, thank you for helping me. It's like
Mhm.
everybody wins out of the
Yeah.
situation, right?
Wow.
So that's fantastic. So lastly,
Yeah.
if there was 1 or 2 immediate action items talking about how to take adversity, pain, challenges, and turning them into a purpose. I really love the ACT acronym, but if there was one last tip you would say, where can someone start? If someone wants to make a change today and say, I want to charge more, I want to, improve my self-value, I want to shift my mindset,
Mhm.
where's the first place to start?
I think it starts with you, really, and looking in and being like, what's something that I struggled with that I overcome? And then using that as like, okay, I can overcome. I can heal. What process did I use? Because a lot of times the process that we use for one pain, we can use that process again for a different pain, right? Like for me, I'm a writer. I'm writing a book, but I love to write and that's how I process. And so I'm like, okay, let me write all my thoughts out because as long as they're in here, they're so shuffled, it's hard to actually look at them and
Yeah,
analyze them, right? So for me, it looks like writing it out, going back and reading it, and then if I still need help, bringing in an expert. You know what I mean? Or going to God or whatever that looks like for you. What is
sure.
that process? But I think you can almost encourage yourself looking at, okay, what's something hard I went through? How did I overcome it? What was the process that I used? Let me take that same process and try to apply it to a new thing I'm trying to overcome. And yes, if you need to pull in experts, I think it's always good to have therapists, coaches, mentors, all of those things. I'm with you. I invest in them. I think it's so important. Um, but
Yeah,
just using your own, almost your own testimony, your own story as a way to encourage you that you can overcome this next battle too.
yeah. So what I'm taking from that is look yourself in the mirror, right? Self-assess.
Yes.
Find a process that works for you. For some
Yes.
people, it's talking to someone. It could be teaching something someone else, trying things. It could be watching a video. It could be listening to audiobooks. It could be writing, like you said. Find a mentor. And I think last one that I know you've mentioned, but I want to sort of put an emphasis on is have a community.
Absolutely.
I think the community is, there's so much that can be done together as a community because it's a support system with
Hmm.
like-minded individuals
Yes.
that are have also been going through, everybody, the journey is like this, right? It's never
Yeah.
linear, right? There's days that you feel like $1 million, and then there's days where you're like, I don't, I these blankets are so comfortable and I'm just staying here all day, right? It's like the weather too, right? The weather can affect that as well.
Uh-huh.
But lovely, lovely. So, Katey, how can folks get to know you more about you, your community, your purpose, your passion, your mission?
All the things. I think the easiest place to find me is on Instagram. I'm on pretty much all the social platforms, but that's kind of like my social home is Instagram. At Katey Maddux, Katey. I'm sure you'll put the tags on the description. In terms of my accounting business, we serve both clients and accountants. So I have courses for accountants. I have templates for accountants. MAQuickbooks.com. Since nobody can really spell millennial correctly, we decided not to use that as the domain. And then kateymaddux.com if you're interested in kind of what I'm doing with sex trafficking work, speaking at women's conferences, ministry, all of that is housed there.
I'm so grateful to have you today to talk about the amazing work that you're doing and the impact you're having in the community, both in the personal, on the business side, and with all these other incredible ventures that you're going into. So thank you for taking the time to share your knowledge and experience with us. And for everyone listening, I'll put all of the notes of how you can get in touch with Katey on the description or in the show notes. And thanks for tuning in. Until next time.
Bye, thanks.